Hey, how's it going, everybody? So today I'm mostly just going to be going over some sculpture techniques, a lot of stuff that I've picked up, especially at Distortions Unlimited. More often than not, I have about 8 hours to sculpt a full head mask. So a lot of these are tricks to, get to a higher quality finished product a lot faster. Usually, if I'm doing wet clay on top of a plaster bust like this, I might soak it in water for a couple hours or so. It just helps the clay stick to it a little bit better. And if anybody has any questions at any point in time, feel free to raise your hand. It'll probably be a minute before I really start talking.
What are you exactly going for, like creature-wise? You don't know?
Not really sure. I mean, I'm not going to do a full face thing. I'm just going to kind of put a little anatomy on one side and start detailing it. But we're going to go over veins, scales, heavy skin texture, wrinkles, that kind of stuff. I know a lot of sculptors, myself included, try to kind of fly past the blocking in phase and getting all the shapes right. And you can have a sculpture that's still got a rake down finish and have it look a lot nicer if you're willing to spend the time to work on the anatomy and make sure that the shapes are dynamic and interesting. Whole lot of people who just kind of want to fly right into the detail because that's the fun part, but should really be spending at least 50% of the time that you're sculpting just figuring the shapes out.
What was your favorite project you ever did?
At Creature Effects Inc., I managed a sculpting team and we did a lifelike Komodo dragon suit for a show in Dubai. That was a really fun project. Reptiles are probably one of my favorite things to sculpt. I love doing scales, so that was kind of everything I could have wanted. Especially, if you're going for a creature design as opposed to just, some sort of messed up looking person. You want to pay a lot of attention to the angles of your sculpture. Like for instance here, if this was something with really sharp teeth and a really gnarly looking mouth, I'd do a heavy brow, kind of going down like this, and make the cheekbone kind of follow suit, and have it be really elevated and angular like that, because what that's doing is it's drawing the eye down to the mouth, which I would want to be the focal point. So you want your, in terms of creature design, you really want your shapes to kind of force the eye to look at the focal point of the sculpture, whatever you decide that is. I talked to a few of you in portfolio review about this, and I know the teachers hound you about it. I'm not using reference here. You should always be using reference. Always, always, always. The only thing that really separates a good sculptor from a poor sculptor is the training of the eye to notice when something's off or something's wrong. So all of our hands can do pretty much the same things. It's just a matter of looking for what's wrong and figuring out how to fix it. So since I've got these harsh angles coming in at the brow and the cheekbone, I'm going to carry those kind of lines and that directionality into the chin a little bit. And you can have opposing lines, you can have opposing angles, just as long as, if you've got a focal point that you want it to focus on, you kind of want it to complement that. This is the stage where you're going to really start wanting to think about anatomy, putting in jaw muscles, the nasal labial folds. You really, it's always work large to small, especially in terms of anatomy. But, if you've got a chin silhouette or a chin profile that you're starting to get happy with, that's when you still want to start fleshing it out and make it look believable. You also want to think about, why certain shapes might exist in nature, like the whole eye socket and the brow and the cheekbone around it. Its natural function is to have something hard that protects the eye. That's why the eye so often, if you're looking at a face from the side, the cheekbone and the brow bone extend out past where the eye is. And that's to keep the fragile soft tissue of the eye protected. So if you've got something that's, maybe a real hard armory reptile or something like that, chances are it's going to have very hard scutes, which are a type of scale, around the eye, because everything's going to need to be rigid to kind of protect that soft tissue in there. I cannot understate the value of having that base knowledge of anatomy, because that's when you can kind of start distorting things. So, a normal person's mouth might end right here. A lot of carnivorous creatures, predatory creatures, stuff like that, they have a longer mouth, and the end of the mouth oftentimes will line more up with the cheekbone than it would with the pupil, like you would see in humans. So we'll start adding some fattier tissues there and make it look like, there's an actual muscle system and muscle structure there that could support some sort of carnivorous jaw. And when it comes to creature design, there's really no such thing as overthinking things. Because if you're thinking about the functionality of every little piece of it, it just makes it that much more believable. The orientation of the teeth, whether they're pointed forward or curved back. If something's pointed forward, it might be so that whatever that mouth needs to eat, it can get to it quicker. And if teeth are curved back, then whatever it's eating is going to have a harder time getting away. It's kind of the nature of monsters in a certain way. I love when we get to do anything big. We do 2 to 3 full-size animatronic T-Rex heads a year. Those are always a blast. And then every few years, we'll get to do some new stuff for Alice Cooper's current roadshow. And we just finished some stuff up for that. It was an absolute blast. Demon babies that would get thrown into a wood chipper and get shredded apart. Updating his guillotine, which was awesome because it's the stage-used guillotine that he's had for 20 plus years now, and it came into the shop and we got to update it and make it look a little more intimidating, and the custom projects like that are always really fun.
Pretty surreal.
Yeah, oh absolutely.
You didn't get to meet him though, did you?
No, I did not. I got to meet his manager. Almost the same. Yeah, exactly. You got to pick your bragging rights.
So are a lot of your stuff, is a lot of your stuff there custom, or do you guys just do some base, like mask making?
Yeah, we've got an entire catalog of products that's been, being developed over 40 years. We make a ton of stuff for the haunt industry, and probably about 50% of the business that we do and the stuff we make is just making products that we ship out to retailers. So, it's really one of the few American mass production companies for that kind of work that's still left. I mean, we have these flatback alien props. Chances are you've probably seen one at some point in your life. They use them in memes, especially with all this Area 51 nonsense that's going on right now.
You don't want to charge it?
No. I like being alive. I mean, I've painted well over 3,000 of those things in my 2 years at Distortions. So once I've got some shapes kind of blocked, once I have some shapes kind of blocked in, I'll, go in and really start refining them. And that's when these wooden kind of, they call them finger tools, because they're intended to be an extension of your finger. It's when these will really come in handy to start kind of just refining the shapes. And anyone in here familiar with Simon Lee, Spider Zero on Instagram? A couple people. Every single one of you should be checking his stuff out. He's one of the best gestural sculptors of all time. It's a lot of really quick studies, anatomy, stuff like that. And he can make something look phenomenal in a short amount of time. And something he talks about a lot is sculpting from your shadows. So rather than just looking at the sculpture, look at the shadows and where they're being cast. And so, it's stuff like that. It's becoming what some might call a good sculptor is really just a matter of kind of changing how you think about sculpting, because, like I said, anybody can move some clay around with their fingers. It's just picking up the techniques and training your brain to make it look good, and understanding when and why it doesn't.
Who's your least favorite project you ever did?
Least favorite. I have been commissioned to sculpt several sets of male genitalia.
Why?
It was, anybody seen Jackass 2?
Yeah.
The bit with Johnny Knoxville? So there was a company that wanted to start making those to sell, and they wanted them in like 4 different sizes. So there was an 8-inch, a 10-inch, a 12-inch, and a 14-inch. That one made me rethink taking commissions.
And like you said, reference, so I'm sure you had reference.
Yeah, gotta have reference.
Sorry, man.
Fortunately, I lived with a bunch of dudes, so it wasn't too hard. So when you're looking at a nasal labial fold on a person, a lot of times it would normally kind of follow around this because the corner of the mouth would be right here. But since the corner of the mouth is all the way back here, I'm just kind of fudging this and making it up and starting the nasal labial fold where it would, but kind of having the transition end in between the cheekbone and the fatty tissues around the back of the lip. And that's that kind of base understanding of anatomy I'm talking about, is understanding where it's supposed to go so that you can make it make a little more sense when you change it.
What are some of your favorite tools? And what do you use them for?
Well, the ones that I have out here right now are what I call my desert island tools. These are tools that I won't lend to anybody, and I have to make sure I've got replacements in a kit back at home. That way, if one breaks, I'm not out on it, especially these Kemper tools. These little wooden wire tools. The company has recently changed the material that the loop is made out of, from a spring steel to just a really flimsy mild steel. And I've got a stockpile about 10, 20 of each of these at my house. And I got it before they changed it. So if there's a sculpting tool you really like, get a ton of extra of them, because you don't know if they're going to stop producing them, you don't know if you're going to lose them, and you don't know if you're going to break them, or if they're going to change how they make them. The new Kemper tools, even on a wet clay sculpture, as great as these things are, they can break so easily. I also really like larger rakes, and a lot of the times I'll modify my tools a little bit, especially with the rakes. A lot of companies will either, like the saw blade rakes that you guys receive in your sculpting kits, those teeth are really sharp, and it honestly kind of like really roughs up the surface more than you need it to, because a rake isn't for like really removing material. A rake is simply for just making it more uniform. So with a new saw blade rake, I'll take it to a belt sander and kind of file those teeth down a little bit so that they're not nearly as sharp and as aggressive. I don't know how well you're gonna be able to see this. So you can barely see the teeth on that thing now. And when you're using it, it creates a much less aggressive pattern on it, and you can focus more on what the rake's intention is, which is to just kind of, rakes are like the sandpaper for sculpting. You start out with your heavier grits and go finer and finer and finer, but with those saw blade rakes, when you're starting out with something big like this and then working to that, it's like going from a kind of medium grit sandpaper back to coarse. You're kind of defeating the purpose of it. Kidney tools, these little finger tools, loop tools I really like. These guys are great for trying to do things quick. It's called a skin texture tool, and all it is 3 pieces of spring steel. I've got them in a few different sizes, again, smaller to larger. But these can create some really convincing textures when you use them properly. And my all-time favorite is this little hairbrush right here. This is a Tangle Angel mini hairbrush. They're $8 on Amazon. These things are magic. You'll see why in about an hour to half an hour. An hour to an hour and a half. Wed clay. Wed clay 110%. If it's something smaller, I really like Monster clay. I don't use Chavant a lot anymore because I don't like how sticky it is, but if it's something that I can sculpt with wet clay, it's almost a guarantee that I will. This is something that I see a ton of artists doing, especially mask makers. If you're really trying to make something look evil and angry, a slanted, squinted eye just, for whatever reason, really does that. Especially when you think about it, anytime you're furrowing your brow, or if a dog's snarling, they scrunch their face up a lot, but their eyes squint because they're focusing on whatever they're looking at. So a squinted eye is a good way to try to make something look a little intimidating. So again, if this is something with a big, scary looking mouth, those muscles would probably be a little exaggerated. That one kind of follows underneath that gap in the cheekbone and connects to the temple there. So if this is something with just a real gnarly set of teeth, I'll put a little extra definition into these muscles. Or, maybe not even extra definition depending on what the design is, but just make sure the muscles are there and are a little more prominent. Because if you look at the side of a person's head, this curve right here that exists is never this drastic. So kind of accentuating that subconsciously tells the mind that
He's a biter.
He's a biter, exactly. I like teeth a lot. Everything I do ends up getting sharp teeth. So now I'm kind of starting to move into the secondary forms. And the secondary forms is really where the expression and the life of the creature, the sculpture, will start to show up. You know, if you've just got your primary blocked out forms and you smooth those out and throw texture or detail on top of it, it'll never look like a real thing. Because, I mean, you know, even just looking at a hand, you know, there's a big kind of flat thing here and there's a bunch of tubes coming out of it, but it dips in here. It's got a little, I don't know if that's a tendon, knuckle. And then it dips again. And then there's a little fatty swell here, dips again. And there's all these, you know, really subtle forms. And if those aren't there, then it's never gonna actually look like a hand and it's never gonna read as a hand. You guys are gonna get tired of hearing me say it by the end of this, but use reference, study anatomy. You don't have to know the names. I don't remember the names of all the muscle groups and stuff, but understand how and why they work, why they're shaped the way they are, and where they are.
You ever sit with a mirror next to you and just make faces in the mirror just to see
Oh, all the time. I probably got 100 or 2 pictures in my phone of me just making weird faces. Is Ronzio in here? Ronzio's furrowed brow is one of my favorite forms of all time. Well, it's got this like, it's not even symmetrical. It's got this like Z shape to it. I love that.
So good.
I used to get so happy when Ronzio would get angry in class and it's just like, yes, reference. So now that, you know, a lot of the kind of rough shapes and some of the secondary forms are in there, this is where I'm gonna really start refining things, and I'll, you know, switch over to those rakes that I was talking about. And this sculpture is a little too small to be using this rake on, but it's what I got, so it's what I'm using. Also, while you guys are here, make a ton of sculpting tools. Experiment with it. If you've ever thought that there was a tool, like there's a tool in your head that doesn't exist out there, try to make it. You may not ever use it. I mean, you know, I've got my stranded island tools that I was telling you guys about, and then I've got a whole bunch of other stuff that I never touch. But occasionally there's a job where one of those tools will come in handy. So, you know, invest into sculpting tools, make your own sculpting tools. It's, realistically, you can do an entire sculpture with one tool if you really want to. The tools just kind of expedite the process and make it all a little bit easier. So having a good arsenal to choose from, even if you barely use 90% of them, is really, really beneficial. And, you know, modifying the tools you already have. Like I said, I like to file down the teeth on my rakes, and you can, you know, modify certain things to make them more comfortable to hold or to do the specific purpose you're looking for. Like I've got a smaller version of one of these that's got way more of these prongs, but it's a really thin gauge steel. So on any clay that isn't super soft, it barely does anything, and they were spread really far apart. And it's too fine for me to ever want to use it on like a life-size sculpture, but a smaller maquette I thought it would be perfect for, but again, they were just too spread apart, so there wasn't enough coverage. It would just be dropping a few lines at a time. So I cut them all in about half, and then, you know, let me just find it, rather than trying to explain one of my tools. Yeah, here it is. So the little wires that were on this were about twice the length. I cut them all down so they would be closer together, and then I kind of bent the tips in a little bit. Probably help if I looked. Yeah, you can see that the tips of it are kind of bent in. And what that's allowing, you know, all of these have like a natural spring to them. And with this being so small and such a thin gauge wire, that spring was just, you know, barely anything would happen with this. And I always really heavily texture my pieces. you know, there's sculptors out there who go for, you know, much more subtle things. I like to exaggerate all of my textures and my details a little bit. So bending these meant it actually kind of dug into the clay and made deeper lines. And then they were closer together, which is, you know, what I wanted out of them. So, you know, if you got a sculpting tool that almost does the job you want it to do, but not quite, mess with it a little bit. Worst thing that happens is you break it and you gotta order a new one on Amazon. But just one of these clay extruders with they come with a bunch of different tips for the clay. I've just got the smallest circular tip that it comes with, and I'll squish out some noodles of this. And the important thing about this is putting it on a piece of paper for about 10 minutes so that the paper can start wicking some of the moisture out of the clay and it doesn't become as fragile, well, still fragile, but not as easy to obliterate when you're trying to blend it into the surface. So about 10 minutes, I'll come back to that and show you how that's done. Tangle Angel mini hairbrush, $8 on Amazon. I am telling you, that is an absolutely magic little tool. This, where to go. This little guy with the Cupid wings, it's magic. Absolutely magic. The reason that it's so important that it's this brand and that it's the Tangle Angel Mini is because these bristles, the material they're made out of, the size they are, and the fact that they don't have the little balls on the end of them make them perfect for refining textures and adding a secondary texture in the process. I've started doing this at Distortions, and you know, like I said, I usually have about 8 hours to do a full head mask sculpture. Doing the detail and texture takes about 20 minutes of that. And it's because of this little thing right here. And you know, sometimes those really simplistic tools can really be what makes the difference. Quite honestly, we don't have to do that much sculpting because we have such a large catalog of existing products. When the trade show season comes around, which is like, you know, Trans World is one of the biggest ones. When it comes to that, it's 2 to 3 months of sculpting, averaging about 1 piece a day. If it's a half head that's going to be grafted onto a flat-backed body prop that we already have, that's I'd be expected to do 2 of those in a day. So, you know, I don't even know how many sculptures I've done for Distortions, but I only sculpt there about 3 to 4 months out of the year. The rest of it is all painting. The back of these little Kemper wooden wire tools have kind of one of those finger tool shapes on them. So you can actually use them to kind of start blending forms together and shaping them a little bit. So, and also one of the advantages of these Kemper wooden wire tools having this kind of secondary tool on the back. They've got, now that's too far away. They've got a few different shapes for these. So you can see this one's much more rounded. Maybe if you can see that. Yeah. So this one's much more rounded. And you know, this one's got more of a point to it, but they both have this kind of curve in here. And the ends of these tools are great for kind of marking out the placement of where your gum or lip connects to the tooth, because these shapes are already pretty much perfect for that. You know, this rounded one is really good for doing more human teeth, and then something that's a little more pointed like this is better for doing the kind of stylized teeth. And you know, really all you have to do is just figure out where you want to put the root. And especially on a lot of creatures, you see a lot of people that put really just even, uniform, perfect teeth on that. And There aren't even that many people who have even, uniform, perfect teeth. You want natural variance in it if you want it to be believable. And you know, obviously you can exaggerate that quite a bit. His gum line's all over the place. All of these teeth are different size and shape. And you know, it's not to say that this is a finished look by any means, but it gives you the kind of basis to go further with it. And overlapping teeth like what I'm starting to do right here can really give it a lot of character, because I don't know about you guys, I don't like to think that my monsters, you know, floss and have a toothbrush and go to the dentist. So, going back to what I was talking about with that clay extruder and making veins. So I'm just gonna smooth this out real quick.
Is that just a sponge?
Yeah, it's just a sponge and some water. I mean, this is actually just mattress foam. I left all my sponges in Colorado.
Is this
So-
an on-the-spot design, or did you?
Yeah, this is just kind of going for it. So, you know what, I'm gonna hand one of these around so you guys can kind of feel the consistency that I'm talking about, and particularly how dry you want to let this get, because you don't want it to get bone dry. You know, you don't want it to get to the point where it's just kind of falling apart, but you don't want that really fragile, pliable clay when you're doing this, because if it's really still soft and squishy, when you go to blend the vein in, it's just gonna disappear. And having it be, you know, a little firmer keeps it intact more. Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of what you want it to be like. It's stiff and it's a little fragile, but it's not completely dry. So I'll just kind of put this on and start adding a little bit of variation to it until it kind of feels like a vein. And when you're doing veins, a lot of times when you get these little hooks or these little curves, that's when the vein will turn into another offshoot of itself and kind of fork a little bit. And so we'll put another one of those right here, and then have a second branch of the vein kind of coming out. You know, and then you just kind of shape it. And in terms of, you know, vein patterning, obviously, again, looking at anatomy is important to understand where veins and capillaries and stuff like that might be. In terms of shape and the way they move, tree branches are great to look at because it all kind of follows the same pattern. So when I've got that on, I'll kind of press it in just to make sure it doesn't move around on me. And I'll just take some moistened fingers and start kind of rubbing it in a little bit.
Your head's blocking.
How's that?
Yeah.
And so once it's started to blend in like that, just take a wet sponge, blend it in a little bit more, kind of stipple some texture on top of it, and then maybe take a dry sponge if it's getting to be a little too much. Let's see if we can get this to catch a little bit more of that shadow. But it's just, you know, extremely quick, subtle veins. Go in and soften and smooth everything with, sometimes it's a chip brush with some water, sometimes it's a sponge with water. I will occasionally use alcohol, isopropyl alcohol instead of water, because the surface of the clay will not stay as wet and tacky for nearly as long, since the alcohol, you know, evaporates and flashes off much faster. This is going to be kind of boring for a minute. These kind of folds down here, you might see the same sort of shapes going on in an old age makeup. It's just adding a little more tension to the neck. That's another thing. Having tension in a sculpture can really kind of set it apart and make it look more professional. And when I say tension, I just mean the look that it's kind of been frozen in a moment of time rather than static. For a long time, especially my mass sculptures, everything was just really static and there was no sort of interesting posing or expressions going on, and it took me too long to figure out that's what was making it look so bland. Yeah, that's just, adding that kind of tension and making it more dynamic it's a really good way to kind of, make it a little more believable, I guess I should say.
Can I feel the texture of that before, so I know?
Yeah. This is still a little wetter than I would normally go, but for the sake of moving forward.
Okay.
Yeah, if anybody wants to feel kind of the consistency the clay is at right now, feel free to come up and touch it. So now that the basis of everything is kind of on there, this is the point where I'll start trying to add a little more life to the sculpture, putting in folds, making the teeth look more like teeth and less like noodles that have just been pressed on. And, adding kind of some depth back in, like in between these teeth, there's so many gaps that there should obviously be some shadows cast in there. And if you just kind of have, it's one of those things you don't want everything to look all flat, and you don't want your sculpture to look like a sculpture, essentially. You want it to look like, something that, with the proper coloration and paint, could be alive. That's the whole business of making monsters, is not making it look like it was made in a special effects lab. And as far as the directionality of some of these folds start going, again, this is something that you can kind of study in nature, but it's one more time just kind of looking at how the tension might be pulling the skin. We've got this kind of large fatty reserve / muscle thing on the end of the lip here, and then it goes into hard bone, so the transition between those two would realistically have to have some give to it to allow that muscle to flex. So that's a good place to start, putting some folds. Because it's like, skin that's not being used at that point in time, so it's kind of wrinkled up and folded. And then, obviously furrowing the brow a little bit, putting the tension in there.
So you do paint along with sculpting?
What's that?
So you just do paint along with sculpting?
Yeah,
What's
yeah.
your favorite paints you use?
Everything we do is just latex or latex and polyfoam, since it's all haunt and Halloween stuff. The base coats we use are always a mixture of house paint, latex, and water. And the beautiful thing about that is we use that for the base coat, and then use FW acrylic artist inks for everything else. But doing that base coat, when it dries, it's one of the few paints out there that cannot get reactivated by alcohol. I don't know if you guys have ever gotten alcohol on a paint job, but it will just obliterate it. So what that allows us to do, it's one of the techniques that we use since we have to paint a lot of stuff really quick. We do what's called a rub out, where we will spray a diluted version of the ink, whether that be like a dark maroon or a brown or a black, depending on the paint scheme. But we'll spray that all over and then take a sponge that's saturated with alcohol and start rubbing the surface of the product or the piece that's being painted. And it's almost like a reverse dry brush. It only leaves that dark color in the recesses and in the shadows, and then it leaves the surface nice and light. And then if you make a mistake at some point when you're doing the inks, you can clean it up with alcohol without having to worry about, bringing it back down to the base. So the combination of those two, I mean, we use that at Distortions, and I use it on all of my own personal projects now because it's a really good system. So I know the people I did portfolio reviews for over today and yesterday probably heard a lot of this stuff already. For those of you who are in earlier semesters or who couldn't make it to portfolio review, I'm going to use some of my time up here to talk about the industry and some kind of misconceptions there might be about the industry. Specifically, if any of you guys are planning on going out to Hollywood and trying to do it out there, there's kind of a method out there, and not necessarily a method in terms of how you make things. It's a hierarchy. Most students don't think this way for the most part, but there are students who are talented that think that they can go out there and just get a sculpting job straight out of the bat, and that is not the case at all. You can be one of the best sculptors in the world. You still have to start out sweeping floors, getting people coffee. You have to work your way up the ladder, and assuming that you don't because you have some degree of natural talent, a lot of times will really negatively affect your career. And page to screen is an incredibly important class for anyone who wants to work in a shop or a studio, because in a lot of ways it's run like an actual shop or studio would be run. And it's the small things that you wouldn't think about that people pay attention to. Properly papering a table. I've seen people lose internships over not being able to paper a table properly. Having wrinkles in it. Lost their internships because of it. And when you're in interviews, you absolutely do not want to overtalk your work. You don't want to come off as cocky, even if you're amazing. Because as good as you are, there's always somebody out there who's better than you. There's always somebody who's better than that person. And even if you're the best out there, you still have room to improve. So you really want to keep that mentality in. People will hire a lot more based off of how well somebody gets along with everyone else and their work ethic than they will off of talent. There are extremely talented sculptors out there who nobody wants to work with. And that's just, kind of the reality of things, is talent is such a small portion of it. And so, you don't want to talk yourself up. You don't want to let your ego ever get the best of you. And you also really don't want to talk yourself down. If somebody's looking at your portfolio in an interview and you say something like, oh, I'm not too happy with this piece, this was rushed, there's a psychological aspect to interviews in the industry that often gets overlooked that you really need to think about. And that is that if, I'm conducting an interview and I'm looking at somebody's portfolio and they say, oh yeah, this was kind of rushed, so it's not my best work. One, if it's not your best work, don't put it in your portfolio. It is quality over quantity, 100% of the time. Anyone who's conducting an interview would rather look at 5 solid pieces than a hodgepodge of 50 things you've done over the course of your entire life. They want a representation of where your skills are at that moment in time. And so if you say something and you kind of want to let your portfolio speak for itself, whether that's positive or negative. But if you talk down on your own work in an interview, I might not have been even thinking the piece I was looking at was bad. But you've just put it into my head that it's bad, and now everything else I'm going to see is bad. So you want to, when you're in situations like that, you really want to choose your commentary carefully. Also, never flip through your portfolio for someone. And when I say that, I don't mean not show someone your portfolio. Show someone your portfolio. Hand it to them and let them flip through it. If they want to stare at something for a long time, they will. If they want to skip past it, they will. And that's just kind of the reality of it. You have to kind of just throw yourself out to the fish and hope they don't eat you. I'm not saying any of this to scare you guys. These are just some of the realities that I wish I would have known about before I moved to California, so I could have been a little more prepared for them.
What was that transition like? Like, how long was it until you were working?
I moved out to California like a month after I graduated Sabini. The first week I was out there, I lucked out and got an internship at Vincent Van Dyke Effects. Then I had a couple weeks where I didn't have anything. Had an internship at MEL, Makeup Effects Labs.
Were the internships paid?
No. The internships will never be paid out there. It's all just, it's the chance for you to get your foot in the door, and it's the opportunity for them to get some free help. But the unpaid internships will rarely last longer than a month. If you've been there longer for a month and you're still not getting paid, you need to have a conversation with them, because at that point they're just taking advantage of you. And you do need to kind of be able to pay attention to if you're being taken advantage of or if you're getting your foot in the door. So I did those 2 internships. I almost moved back to California because I wasn't just getting any leads on paid work. But I would go to the effects supply stores out there, put out business cards, ask who was hiring, call around, use every resource at your disposal. And I was actually visiting Colorado, thinking about just not going back to California. And I got a call from Quantum Creation Effects. They were looking for a runner. Those of you who are not familiar with that, a runner is person who sweeps the floors, cleans the bathroom, and picks up the supplies for everybody else. But it was a paid position, so I took it. I did that for a few months. Saw on Facebook that a smaller shop was looking for sculptors. Sent out some of my work, just kind of hoping that it might turn out, and I got the job. When that job was over, I went back to Quantum and worked as a sculptor for the first time there. And pretty much after that point on, it was strictly sculpting. But there have been and will be times that, especially if you go out and do it in California, you need to be prepared for this. Just because you were doing something somewhere else does not mean you get to do it there. There have been people who, leave and go do a sculpting job and then come back to a shop that they'd worked at previously, and they're still in the mold shop. You can choose the jobs you accept, but you're not really in control of what position you take. All you can really do is just put your best effort towards the job that you want, and make it apparent to your coworkers and your employers that it is what you want to do. When I was interviewing at Vincent Van Dyke Effects for the internship, one of the first things he asked me, and this is a question that you should be prepared for, is what I wanted to do in the industry. Because especially out there, everything is very, very segmented. Every studio has mold makers who only make molds, sculptors who only sculpt, painters who only paint, foam runners who only run foam. It's all segmented. And a buddy of mine was also interviewing for this internship. The only reason I got it over him was because I said I wanted to be a sculptor, and he said he wanted to be an on-set makeup artist. A studio really has no use for an on-set makeup artist because they're a studio. They just ship the prosthetics they make out to a makeup artist. So questions like that are what you want to pay attention to. But something that Vincent told me when I told him that, I'd like to eventually be working as a sculptor, was to always have a sculpting project in the works that, I was doing on my own free time. And to bring that in on all my lunch breaks, bring lunch from home and work on it over my lunch break so I could keep showing people that I like sculpt, I want to sculpt, and I'm here to eventually be able to sculpt. And I would once a week wear a shirt that said I'd rather be sculpting. You just kind of want to hammer it into their heads. And then eventually they'll need a sculptor and they'll think of you. Or they'll need a painter, or they'll need a mold maker. Now another piece of advice I can give, I know a lot of people don't like making molds, and I've met a few people here who actually do like making molds, which is good to hear because working as a mold maker is the most in-demand position in the effects industry. Every studio needs mold makers pretty much all the time. So the likelihood of getting your foot in the door, if you're all right with making some molds, at least just to start out, is significantly higher. And that also gives you an opportunity to get into the shops and start talking to the painters, or even as a runner, you sometimes will end up dropping off the prosthetics or the costumes that have been made to set, so you can talk to the people who are on set and the unionized makeup artists. And it's, just understanding that getting your foot in the door is difficult. And you're never gonna start in the job that you want. I can think of one student that I know of that went out to California and immediately started working as a sculptor, and he can sculpt circles around me. He's one of the best sculptors I've ever seen come out of this school. But everyone else I've known, even some of the best artists out there, they go out there and they start as interns, or maybe their first paid job is working in the mold shop. And that's just, that's kind of the way it is, and it's far from being a bad thing. It's, it's like, if you were to start at a Fortune 500 company, you don't start as the CEO. You start by getting people coffee, and you work your way up from there. Again, going back to the trying to create tension and, a degree of dynamic action in the sculpture, another thing that can do that really well is some kind of exaggerated crow's feet, especially when you've got that squinted eye, because then that flesh, when the eye squints, the flesh here is going to bunch up. And so much is just understanding how skin and muscles move and interact with each other. And I'm far from perfect at it. The best sculptor in the world is far from perfect at it. But the best thing you can do is every time you pick up clay, focus on trying to learn something or better a certain aspect of your sculpting. And one of the ways that I do that, and a lot of people I know have done that, is by looking at a sculptor whose work you really, really like. Whether that's Jordu Shell or Mikey Rotella, or a sculptor that nobody even knows. Just really analyzing their work and figuring out why it is that you like it and why it is that you think it's better than yours. Make a list of all the reasons. Maybe they have more convincing secondary form. Maybe the way they do their textures and details is just much more realistic. And focus on those individual components and focus on trying to get better at those individual things. Because eventually, if you do that enough, you'll be getting better at the entire art of sculpting. But start with anatomy. And use reference. Just to show you guys a little different, I'm going to give him some scales down here on the corner of his jawline. It really is. That smells good too. I love the way wet clay smells. So the scales have to a certain degree becomes something that is a little bit of my specialty. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Distortions does a series of tutorials on YouTube called the Monster Lab. And Ed had me do one on sculpting scales a few years ago. Like I said, they are something that I really, really enjoy sculpting. But just a few things to kind of understand about how scales work and what they are before you try sculpting them is, so many people kind of treat scales as a texture, a texture to the skin, and it's something entirely different. They're made out of the same keratin that your fingernails or that your hair is made of, and they're actually a growth that protrudes on top and through the skin. So reptilian skin still exists and it's still kind of folded in between the scales and works in between them. It's just not as apparent. But it's important to understand that there's kind of two levels to that. There's the scales and then there's the skin underneath. And a good way to start that is what's called the power of the X. And this is just a good way to put texture on really any sort of monster, but you're just making a lot of X's and doing it in kind of natural patterns like that, where the skin might actually follow, because again, you have to do your best to try to think about these as, flowing with the skin, but not being a part of it. And I'll just go in and kind of pick out those areas in between the X's. And I'll let those lines that I drew in kind of guide exactly where I put these things. And then as we get over here where I'm not going to be having any scales, I'll look to the edge of one scale, maybe like right here, and I'll carry that into the wrinkle. So it's, that skin that's underneath is transitioning back into just regular old skin. And going back to the kind of tension and, knowing where to place your wrinkles, you're thinking about the tension. Doing something like this that I've just done here, where they're kind of opposing like this, but they've spread out into kind of a fan. I don't know if there's a technical term for that. I just call them radial wrinkles. I'll just kind of start out with that fanned shape, and then, occasionally offshoot one, or add a smaller one in here. And as they go to these kind of pulled tendons, I'll wrap them around, and then they go a little deeper in between. This is all kind of just the preliminary base. There's going to be a lot more levels and layers to the detail and texture. You kind of want to think about it in the same way that you would paint. You don't just kind of slap on one coat of paint and call it done if you're trying to make it realistic. You do it layer by layer and just add a little bit more each time. Sometimes you'll be redefining something. Sometimes an area like this where the skin has been pulled really tight over this fat deposit, I'll go a lot more subtle, or maybe just not even put any wrinkles on it, because the skin's been pulled tight, so a lot of those creases are getting kind of stretched out of it. And so these scales that I've got on kind of the, I don't know, I guess you'd call it the jowl here. Just kind of going in and redefining them a little bit, rounding off their edges. So with these little Tangle Angel hairbrushes, when you've got it to an area like this, you've got a lot of details and wrinkles kind of roughed in there, but they still just look like they're carved in. What this thing does, you scrub it around on the surface in circles, and it's gonna knock all of this back and start blending it together. And while it's doing that, these bristles actually form a secondary texture on the surface. So it's kind of knocking out a few different steps all at the same time.
How much pressure are you applying?
Not very much at all.
Basically just like
That's a Tangle Angel brush?
Yep, this is the Tangle Angel hairbrush.
Is it wet?
What?
Is it wet?
It is not wet, no. This is dry right now.
I like silicone and crystals.
There's some sort of kind of soft plastic. So, it doesn't look like there's really a lot going on here right now. That's completely all right. That brush, I don't know how well you can see it on the camera, but it kicks up a lot of these little crumbs that they gather in the crevices, and quite frankly, they look horrible. Once you do that, you go back in with a hair dryer. You'll start going over it, and since those pieces of clay are separated now and so much smaller, they'll dry out a lot faster than the rest of the sculpture will, and almost completely independently of it. And you can use baby powder while you're doing this. I try to stay away from baby powder now. I don't know if you guys have heard anything about this. It's basically confirmed that talc causes cancer. Yeah, so it's really not something you want to be breathing in if you can avoid it. At this point, I would genuinely use a dust mask anytime I'm using baby powder. What's that? I've never tried it. I'd imagine you probably could. I'm sure it would work just as well, but I just haven't tried it. What's that?
weren't they gonna start taking talc out of baby powder?
Oh, they very well may have at this point. I don't know a whole lot about all this chemical. I just found that out, and for years I was just throwing baby powder on every sculpture I did.
Just breathing.
Constantly, yeah. And so again, just like with painting, you're kind of doing this in layers and passes. And so now that a lot of these kind of primary folds and deeper wrinkles are in there, I'll start adding the kind of finer ones, and I'll keep going back with that Tangle Angel and kind of knocking it all back every time I do this. Again, reference. You want to pay attention to the direction that these are going and how these, small, kind of wrinkly textures are actually overlapping with each other. More often than not, they kind of form X's all across the surface. So going back and forth, slightly changing the angle, can really help with that.
Did you fall in love with sculpting when you came here? Or do you?
I've loved sculpting for a very long time. I was absolute trash at it until I came here. And not like I'm the best in the world now, but that's kind of where it started turning around. And when it gets to this point, I'm kind of just constantly going back and forth with the hair dryer, getting it a little bit drier and drier with each texture pass I do, so it's showing up more and more subtly. Trying to make all those layers just kind of start falling into each other a little bit. Now that it's a little firmer, again, just going back in with the Tangle Angel. Tangle Angel Mini, $8 on Amazon.
Now, how did you?
So in doing this process, these scales that I've got on the lower jaw here have really kind of fallen in and just kind of blended in with the rest of this a little too much. So I'm just gonna go back in and redefine them before the next pass. Because I want these to stand out a little more than some of the other details on the sculpture and the other textures.
Can we see the tool you're using?
Yes. So this is one of my all-time favorite tools as far as doing details and stuff like this goes. This is the Kemper W21. It's got this little kind of fancy four-shaped loop on it. So the surface finish is getting very close to a point where I would call it finished. I'm gonna go back in one more time with the hair dryer so I can get all of these little crumbs out of the cracks. And then I'm gonna go over everything with the wet sponge, just kind of lightly brushing it, but more so stippling on top. Stippling with a little bit of water can actually really do a lot for your texture, especially if it's something that's like primarily smooth. It can add just a really nice subtle texture so that it doesn't look weird. And especially because a lot of times, before you really learn how to smooth clay is, full of brush strokes and fingerprints and tool marks. So doing this technique can kind of help you get rid of that and make it look a little more polished while you allow yourself to practice getting a smoother finish. Again, just taking a wet sponge, I'll kind of just lightly brush the surface. I don't want to lose a ton of this texture, but I just want to knock it back a little bit. I'm just stippling on top of everything. And, sometimes you'll get areas where it's a little more drastic than you want. Just switch over to a clean, dry sponge, pick some of that back up. At this point, all that's really left for the demo is I'm just gonna, kind of smooth out the eye a little bit and smooth out the teeth. So if you guys got any more questions, now would definitely be a good time to ask them, because I think the sculpting aspect of this is just about finished. Well, if you want to learn how to sculpt well and fast, first thing you got to do is learn how to sculpt good.
Yeah.
Second thing you got to do is learn how to sculpt fast, because the first time you start trying to sculpt fast, it's always going to look horrible. Some of the stuff from my earlier sculptures at Distortions, I like to pretend they don't exist, even though I have to see a couple thousand of them a year. But no, again, separate those two aspects of sculpting. Learn how to sculpt well, and then learn how to sculpt fast, and then start integrating the two of those together. It's one of those things where if you try to tackle everything at once, it's just frustrating and you don't understand why you can't figure it out. It's because you have to kind of compartmentalize the aspects of sculpting that you need to get better at and just tackle them one at a time. And as you start getting better at a certain one, maybe you can open yourself up to, saying, okay, I've gotten a little better at doing a realistic skin texture. I'm going to focus on anatomy for a few months now. And to get better at sculpting, you really have to be sculpting as constantly as you possibly can. If you've got free time after work or free time after school, spend it sculpting. If you want to be a sculptor, that is. Some people want to be painters. There's probably some people that don't even really want to make monsters.
So you talked about sealing your clay. Is that for molding?
Yes.
What do you use?
I use what has been the staple at Distortions for the past 40 years. It is Krylon Gloss Leather Brown. I spray that on, let it sit overnight. The longer you let it sit, the drier it gets and the less of a chance that you have that it'll stick to the plaster. And we use colored spray paint. Crystal clear is kind of the industry standard, but the advantage to using a colored spray paint is if you have any of it left over in the mold, you'll actually be able to see it so you know where to clean it out. Because I've had a couple masks where I just kind of like really rushed into the molding, and when I would pull the mask out after dwelling it, it would have these weird little thin spots where the crystal clear was still in the mold and had stopped the plaster's porosity from actually absorbing the moisture in the latex and creating an even thickness. So for that reason, I really like using a colored spray paint as a sealer. And just like with the rakes or, with sandpaper, if you were making something out of wood, with my brushes, I kind of like to have different coarsenesses. Like this is fairly stiff bristles. And I'll use this to kind of start out just to kind of like soften everything. And once the shapes have kind of gotten soft enough and they're starting to look a little more like a tooth, I'll switch over to this, which I'm pretty sure is a makeup brush. Really, really soft bristles. And I won't get it nearly as wet and just start, smoother strokes going in one direction. So if you do get any brush strokes showing up, they're not, really distracting to the eye. And I'll do the same thing with this eye socket and the eyelids up here. Starting with our more aggressive brush. And then a little bit of sponge so the eyelid texture matches the rest of everything. And going back in, a little bit of water on a very soft brush and just kind of smoothing out the actual eye. And does anybody have the time?
4:38.
All right. I think that's about where we'll call it as far as the sculpting demo goes.